Okay, everyone. So my name's Heather Brutz, and this is the webinar Electric Vehicles and Resilience During Natural Disasters. I work with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, where I am the Transportation Program Director. And to start us off, I'm going to go and hand it over to Ron Townley with Upper Coastal Plains Council of Governments.
Good afternoon, everybody. As she said, I'm Ron Townley with Upper Coastal Plain Council of Governments. I just wanted to welcome everybody here today. Upper Coastal Plain is sponsoring this webinar across the state, and even I think we have some participants signed up from other states today. But it is also focused in large part on our region, which here in the Upper Coastal Plain region constitutes Northampton, Halifax, Nash, Edgecombe, and Wilson counties. As many of you may know, the state and federal government has been placing increasing emphasis on disaster resiliency. As such, after the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to ARPA funds, the state let contracts to all the 16 councils of governments across North Carolina to work on disaster resiliency. We are sharing a component and making with High Street Consulting to create workshops and training modules for local governments, focused on small local governments, but for all local governments, around financial management, grants management, federal reporting, and other elements. Be looking for that during this winter and spring. In addition to that, each Council of Governments, including Upper Coastal Plain, wrote in elements of their own disaster resiliency needs, based in part on the North Carolina RISE process, the resulting vulnerability assessment, the project portfolio, hazard mitigation plan analysis, and other things. This component today covers one of those areas that were of interest to our member governments around electric vehicles and energy. And there'll be, we have contracted with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center and Applied Data Research Institute to perform certain functions we'll be reviewing today. Our member governments as well can utilize this team through our Council of Governments to look at backup storage energy needs for your critical facilities, microgrids, and things like that we'll be talking about more soon. So welcome everybody. Please put your questions in the chat to the organizers and panelists. We'll be handling those at the end of the hour. We have a lot to cover. There are a lot of slides, so I didn't make slides on what I just mentioned, but you can always follow up with me if you have questions about the grant or the disaster resilience stuff in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. So as I said before, my name's Heather Brutz. Go on to and joining me today will be Alexander Yoshizumi from the Applied Data Research Institute and Isaac Panzarella, my colleague with the Clean Power and Industrial Efficiency program here at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off just by going and doing some level setting in terms of talking about what resilience is. So this quote, I think, helps to explain, what resilience is very well. It's from the North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. A resilient North Carolina is a state where our communities, economies, and ecosystems are better able to rebound, positively adapt to, and thrive amid the changing conditions and challenges, including disasters and climate change, to maintain quality of life, healthy growth, and durable systems, and to conserve resources for present and future generations. And so there are some different aspects of the resilience that are very important, but at its heart, it's about being able to plan for and adapt to changing circumstances. This particular webinar, we're really going to be talking about natural disasters, especially hurricanes, but it certainly can be broader than that. So next slide. Okay, if you can play the video there. So this footage is drone footage from NCDOT. It's showing I-40 after Hurricane Florence. As you can see, I-40 basically looked like a river. So those of us who live in North Carolina probably remember this quite well. I just wanted to go and show this to kind of like indicate like this is what we're facing. And so this is not just a challenge for electric vehicles, it's a challenge for any sort of vehicle. But today we're going to be talking about some of the specific ways that we can go and plan for our infrastructure in terms of making sure that electric vehicles and their charging infrastructure are resilient. Next slide. So some of the vulnerabilities that we face when we're thinking about electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and as well as general fueling infrastructure. So if you have a regular gasoline or diesel vehicle, your gasoline or diesel supplies can be disrupted during major storms. Same way, if the electrical grid is out, then that can affect obviously the chargers. And it also affects the fueling dispensers for gasoline and diesel because generally speaking, unless they have backup, they're not able to go and operate without power. And another vulnerability that we need to go and plan for is flooding, which both can prevent vehicles from being able to access charging or fueling infrastructure. And it also means that you have to go and make sure that the charging and fueling infrastructure will continue to function or afterwards if it's flooded. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about reliability, resilience, and redundancy. So resilience implies many different things. So it comes from having reliable chargers that operate under adverse conditions. It also has to do with having redundancy in chargers so that if one is offline or inaccessible, that there are other ones that can be used in its place that aren't super far away. And it also has to go and do with how quickly offline chargers can go and begin to function again. And I did want to go and say that while in some of my introductory slides, I talked about both gasoline and diesel and as well as electric vehicles, from here on out, I think we're mostly going to be talking about electric vehicles. I just wanted to acknowledge that these challenges are faced by many different types of vehicles. So with regards to reliability, chargers need to be able to operate under difficult conditions. So that means that when the electric grid is out, it's really great if they can still operate, or at least crucial chargers can still operate. Financially, it's probably not feasible to go and have every single charger have these sorts of backup systems. So some of the backup systems that we'll talk about in greater detail can be backup power, microgrids. Isaac will be talking more about that later on. You can also consider for when you're placing public chargers, strategically doing so that they're on higher ground, so that they're less likely to flood. And that they still could be flooded around them, which means that people won't be able to get to them, but that does at least mean that they're more likely to continue functioning in the aftermath of the storm and the waters recede. You also can design chargers so that minor flooding doesn't destroy the electrical systems. And so that's by doing things such as making sure that key electrical components are higher up in the charger. If they're 18 or 24 feet up, not feet, 18 to 24 inches up some of the crucial electric components, then in most floods, that won't necessarily mean that the entire charger will be unable to operate afterwards. Really major floods are just very, very difficult to plan for. And then redundancy, it has to do with the idea of having enough chargers so that if one charger is out of commission, a driver doesn't have to go and drive a really long distance to get to another charger. Next slide. So these are the designated alt fuel corridors in North Carolina. This image is from NCDOT. And so as you can see, those routes that are in red, those are the routes that under the NEVI program are going to have high-powered DC fast chargers every 50 miles. And so that will help a lot, but we'll go and have some more geographic analysis later to go and talk about, what are some of all the different routes that people are using. And next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex now.
Hello, I'm Alex Yoshizumi with the Applied Data Research Institute, and I'll be going through some of that geospatial analysis that we were talking about. So when we're thinking about hurricane evacuation routes and electric vehicles, one of the things that we felt was important as a way to frame it were what are our concerns in question form. So one of the big things that we care about is how much charging capacity is needed to support future levels of battery electric vehicle adoption. And so to contextualize that piece, we can look at the whole of the US, where data from forecasts from EIA indicate that both market share and vehicle stock, light duty stock, so the vehicles that are actually on the road, are projected to increase over time when we look at electric hybrids, plug-in electric hybrids, and then also battery electric vehicles, which are in that deepest yellow. If we sort of focus in a little bit more into North Carolina and more broadly the Southeast, we can see that across the nation, North Carolina is 10th for electric vehicle adoption, and it's 16th currently for specifically battery electric vehicle adoption, which indicates that the vehicle only is using the battery, is plug-in, and it cannot drive from an alternative fuel source like gasoline in the case of hybrid. We can see here that across the Southeast, only Florida, Georgia, and Virginia surpass North Carolina in adoption currently. But all of these states are sort of growing seemingly on an exponential track currently. And if we zoom in even further to North Carolina, we can see that as of the most recent reporting from NCDOT, there were 55,500 battery electric vehicles registered in the state of North Carolina, 18,800 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles registered. And so together, over 74,000 zero emission vehicles, which for North Carolina designates a ZEV as including both fully electric plug-in as well as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And so when we look at Executive Order number 80, which was set forth in October 2018, we're very likely going to hit 80,000 ZEVs sometime either this year or in 2024. So we're definitely on our way to meeting that goal. And then when we look at Executive Order number 246, which was set forth in January 2022, the goal is to hit 1.25 million ZEVs by 2030. And so something that we did was to look at electric, this is battery electric and then plug-in electric hybrid vehicles over time, as far back as NCDOT ZEV data went. And we saw that average monthly growth was approximately 3.12% statewide. And so just as a hypothetical, at this growth rate, we would hit 1.1 million ZEVs by end of year 2030. But I think it's also important to note that projections for battery electric vehicle adoption year over year have consistently fallen short of reality thus far. And it's also a market that is changing rapidly. So it can be hard to say what the future might hold. And so here is, I guess, one more granular step looking at the counties over time. And I think an important takeaway from this is that this is battery electric vehicles specifically. Battery electric vehicle adoption in the state of North Carolina and across the US is varies substantially by geography. And we see this evidenced when we look at particular counties. But I think several important points to make, especially when we're thinking about Upper Coastal Plain Council of Governments as a region. The sum for counties along the coast, so this is touching the Atlantic, is over 3,300 registered battery electric vehicles. And then additionally, when we take a look at the region, it's serving as a corridor for the county with the most battery electric vehicles in the state. So that corridor for tourism going to the Outer Banks, going to the coast, and other coastal counties are frequently passing through here. So, so I think that illustrates how we're thinking about charging capacity and making sure that we're accounting for and prepared for future levels of battery electric vehicle adoption. Another important question is what happens if charging infrastructure loses power or becomes inaccessible? So to contextualize that, we wanted to look at both existing wetlands as well as flooding and historical surface water observations. So on this map, we can see designated wetlands by US Fish and Wildlife Service. On the next slide, we can see flood hazards as indicated by FEMA. So we can sort of see that area grow. And then one more thing that we did was we looked at historical surface water occurrence. So this is if surface water has been recorded at any time from 2013 to present from Landsat 8 satellite imagery. And that's what that sort of lighter cyan color is. And we can see in relation to evacuation routes that there's substantial overlap. Especially in this US 64, as well as US 64 alternate. And so one last question to contextualize the work was, which locations add the most resilience to the system? Because at the end of the day, there's a set amount of funding, and we care a lot about allocating resources judiciously. And so to get at that question, I think a first lens is to look at it from existing charging infrastructure. We can see that this is public DC fast chargers, so level 3 charging. And this includes all plug types. And I think when we look at all plug types, there is a fair amount of coverage to varying degrees along North Carolina's coast and sort of connecting the coast to the Piedmont. When we go back and forth between looking just at CCS plugs, for example, we can see that there is less coverage, and this is CCS. And I think this is further illustrated when we look at the service areas for this infrastructure. So here's an example of a 30-mile service area for all public DC fast charging infrastructure. And if we compare this to just CCS, we can see that there are gaps that don't exist when we look in the aggregate. And something important to note is that this is also true of CHAdeMO. This is also true of Tesla plugs. There are gaps that exist in the absence of other plug types, and there's not currently, for many vehicles and plug types, the ability to convert between. In some cases, there are, but it's not true across the board, across all plug types. And one further thing that I guess complicates this is that the locations that add the most resilience to the system, we can't just look at where chargers are located, because we also care about the nature of traffic coming off of the coast. So in this example, I show the planned evacuation zones as designated by the state of North Carolina. And so it's important to consider when populations are leaving the coast, from where, and that's something that's really hard to get at without some type of traffic modeling or simulation modeling. And so that sort of leads really nicely into some of the work that I'm going to give examples of work that we have done and work that we are actively doing and building out. So thinking about these three questions, one of the approaches that we've taken to answer them is to build out the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Resilience Model, or AFIRM for short. And what AFIRM is an agent-based model. So that means that the vehicles within the model can act autonomously of one another. They decide when to charge or when to keep going, and their actions affect each other. So if a vehicle decides to charge at a given location, it means that there's one less plug available to other battery electric vehicles on the road. It's a network model and that it's composed of nodes and lines. It accounts for traffic flow in that the density of traffic along a line segment affects the speed, the average speed at which vehicles are traveling. And then speed affects the energy consumption of vehicles on the road. And then it's designed to assess EVSE capacity, amongst other things. So we can ask questions like how many charging ports, how far apart, and at what power rating. This is a section I won't spend too much time on, but I'm happy to speak more to if there are questions. Just wanted to illustrate some of the parameters that we've included and that we have conducted research on to build the model out. So here we break parameters into the vehicle agents, the nodes, which includes the interchanges and the EVSE, the lines, which are the roads themselves, and then traffic flow itself gets parameterized. And so if we look at the vehicle agents, we can see users can control the penetration levels of battery electric vehicles, their composition, so that has to do with market share and the types of vehicles that are on the road. We give the example of two parameter probability distributions here, where we're looking at vehicle start time probability, as well as the probability of starting or ending at a given node. When it comes to the nodes themselves, less parameters, but we include EVSE stations here, or EV charging stations, and users can modify the number of plugs for both level 2 and level 3, as well as the power ratings. We include lines, which is just the length of the line, the number of lanes, and free flow speed, because these all affect the traffic flow. And then, of course, we have traffic flow, in which users can select between different models of density speed relationships. So in understanding the model a little bit better, the way that it works is we run it for a 24-hour period, and it runs at 1-minute intervals. So these numbers, the 60, 120, 180, that corresponds to the number of time steps. So this is 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and so forth. And when we look at this chart, this is really showing what an average day we would expect to look like. Because in every single time step, vehicles have an associated operating state. So that includes starting, driving, waiting in traffic, charging, waiting for charger, finished, and depleted. And to assess how well a route, like an evacuation route, is handling capacity, we really are interested in looking at charging, waiting for charger, and depleted, as that can tell us a lot about how well the infrastructure is handling the levels of adoption and the behaviors that we're throwing at it. So for this work, we did a case study of I-40 from Wilmington to the I-40, I-95 interchange. And some of the things that we were able to extract from that included electricity consumption, for one, which is probably more of interest, we imagine, to the utility side. And the way to read all of these charts is that we have time on the x-axis, power in kilowatts demanded on the y-axis, And the lightest yellow is the full envelope, so the full range that we observed running 10 simulations per scenario. The lighter yellow lines represent the individual simulations, and we can see that there's a lot of variance that occurs at certain times more than others. And then we also have the scenario mean in dark yellow. When it comes to the actual infrastructure, one of the things that we were able to pull out was when we start hitting capacity limits. So not only are we able to look at how things change across adoption levels, so this is the proportion of vehicles that are battery electric in the simulation, we're also able to look at how it differs across trip urgency or different evacuation types. So in planned evacuations, the infrastructure along the route seems to be able to handle it fairly well from what we've observed. We see there is the possibility for capacity to be hit in high scenarios, but mostly where our main concern is in semi-urgent scenarios, in medium and high, where there's the potential for more substantial backup over longer periods of time for vehicles waiting for a charger. And then another thing that we're able to look at that sort of harkens back to that question of what if we lose power, or what if part of a route becomes inaccessible, and so part charging infrastructure becomes inaccessible, is to look at the role that different stations or sort of, I guess, exits play in the overall resilience of the route. We can see here in this example, if we take Wilmington offline, so that's that exit 420, it doesn't have an especially large impact from when we look at all accessible. The root mean square difference is an indication of how different it is from this base scenario of all charging stations being accessible. And we really start to see more substantial differences when the routes that are further out, that represent sort of those bridges to the Piedmont for electric vehicle charging. In this example, we can see that waiting for charger increased on average overall, as did depleted. And then in this case, we see that it looks like it decreased, and it did in terms of vehicles waiting for a charger, but that's because it was combined with a substantial increase in vehicles depleted along the route. So these are vehicles that were that continued forward to try to charge at exit 364 and were greeted with an inability to access charging. And so when we're thinking about the next steps for a firm as it relates to work in this region, we are currently building out the network model for US 64 and parameterizing rules for the network. And then we're going to use that to identify under what adoption levels and evacuation conditions capacity becomes an issue, as well as identify the locations where adding plugs maximizes resilience. And some of the locations that we've selected with feedback from Upper Coastal Plain Council of Governments include Tarboro, Williamston, Plymouth, and Columbia. And so as a complement to all of that work, we're also going to be identifying which locations are best for siting EVSE. And this is on a much finer spatial resolution. So looking granularly across a continuous surface to identify which locations might be best. And to do that, we're including suitability criteria that fall under 5 different broad categories, but there are many variables that we're looking at, is over 50 currently. And they cover infrastructure, population and vehicle density, hazards, equity and access, and points of interest. An important step for that work, and a step that we're excited to engage local governments on, is getting thoughts and feedback on how the criteria should be weighted. And I think that that's something that will be worth looking out for as we move forward with this work, especially over the coming webinars and meetings. It's something that we really value and we really want to engage stakeholders on. And so the results of that work will be an example suitability layer, site suitability layer for both one for level 2 charging and one for level 3 charging. This is an example of work conducted by the city of Raleigh, although we expect that our work will be a much finer resolution, twice as fine in terms of area per observation cell, or per grid cell, that is to say. So we're excited to continue that work forward. And I look forward to your questions when we get to that at the end. But for now, I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Isaac, who will speak more to the microgrids part of this work.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex. Fascinating work. You're just amazing at all the details in your modeling work. Now that we've kind of covered, what are the needs for capacity and where will resilient charging stations be most helpful and effective as a resource, I'm going to talk about options that are out there currently to make charging infrastructure more resilient. And again, we're focused on EV charging infrastructure here. There's really three kind of key areas. One is, the first one is making the utility grid more resilient. And that's primarily up to, your utility, either Duke Energy, who are doing some work, let's say in Hot Springs, North Carolina, to make that grid more resilient. On the eastern part of the state, some of the co-ops have done a good job, or at least, making steps to make the grid more resilient. And that includes Tidelands EMC and Brunswick EMC. Then there's making the charging equipment itself more resilient. And then finally, microgrids, which is primarily the work that I'm involved in, is analyzing and supporting the deployment of microgrids. Next, please. Heather talked about resiliency versus reliability a little bit. And what I wanted to make a point of here in this slide is that what we're talking about in terms of making things more resilient is looking at low frequency but high impact, long duration events. And as you see in the chart to the right there are some of these events that have hit different parts of the grid around the country. Superstorm Sandy was an example of them, where you had a lot of loss of load. But it's a very small percentage of the types of events that happen. That's less than 0.01% of all the events. But we do have to plan for those events because they can have significant impacts on people, livelihoods, and the communities. Next, please. There are a number of resilient EV charging equipment technologies that have come out in the last 10 years or so, and more are coming out and under development as people innovate. This chart shows just a few of those types of technologies and some of the considerations for implementing them. Integrated batteries, where you have a charging station with battery integrated into the unit, gives you some unique benefits. Basically here, the grid charges the battery, and the storage helps you to actually reduce the electric load that you need from the grid while you're charging, as opposed to a charging unit without a battery where you just be connected directly to the grid. And I've got an example of this later on. But this helps where you have maybe limited electric infrastructure or capacity within the infrastructure, where you can support greater charging power without putting the load directly on the grid. One of the drawbacks of this system is it can have limited capacity, especially if there's a large outage. You only have the capacity that's available in the battery itself. Another technology combination is solar PV and batteries integrated together. Here you overcome some of the challenge of limited capacity. You're adding the capability to generate power with solar panels during the daytime and store that for any time of the day when it might be needed in batteries. There's units of this type that are mobile, and that's an example of one you see here. But there's also stationary installations, and that's probably more like a microgrid, which I'll talk more about later. There's single service stations as opposed to centralized kind of units where you might have a battery that serves multiple charging stations or a solar array that serves multiple charging stations. And there's benefits and drawbacks to each of those. And then finally, as far as this technology is considered, it can be grid connected, where it's interacting with the grid and charging from the grid. It also could act as an islanded system where it's just standalone, and this is a case of that here, where it is a mobile standalone system. The third technology that's being deployed is a gas generator-based technology, and this could also be a fuel cell type of generator as well. These can be mobile. Here's one that's on a trailer. It could also be skid mounted and connected to the grid as well. So you have grid power, and then there's the generator, which takes the fuel to generate electricity as it's demanded. Different fuel types can be used in this type of setup, and that includes propane or natural gas. It could include methane from a renewable source. And in the future, we're going to see units like this being fueled potentially from hydrogen. Next, please. So what is a microgrid? This is a definition that was come up with about 14 years ago by the Department of Energy's Microgrid Exchange Group. I was part of that group for a little while as they finished their work. What it is, it's a group of interconnected loads and distributed energy resources that have a clearly defined boundary and acts as a single controllable entity with respect to the grid. Second part of this is that the microgrid has the capability to connect and disconnect from the larger utility grid, so it can operate in either one of two modes, grid connected or island mode. And as far as the first part goes, you can have various resources, distributed energy resources that can serve the loads within the microgrid. That might include a diesel generator or battery storage, PV, a lot of different resources within the grid that are typically sized to the needs of the microgrid when it's going to be islanded. And when we say islanded, basically it's disconnecting from the grid at will, either in advance of a disaster or in anticipation of an outage, or during an outage, and then operating independently. And you want to size the microgrid to whatever loads within that microgrid you want to be powered in the event of an outage. In some cases, it's going to be just some select components or loads within the microgrid. In other cases, let's say a hospital, you probably want the whole hospital, all of its loads to be powered during an outage condition. And there's some really good examples of that. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about microgrids and EV charging specifically. Next, please. So I've got three snapshots here of different resilient EV charging technology installations. Here's one where you have standalone charging at a military installation. And this one is at Marine Corps Logistics Base in Albany, Georgia. Here you have a charger that's capable of providing up to 5.6 kilowatts of power. And that would depend that delivery will depend on, what's available in the battery and what's coming in from solar energy. It has a 4.4 kW solar array, and this one has a 40 kilowatt hour battery. You can have smaller batteries, but the bigger the battery, of course, you get larger capacity. This was installed here in Albany, Georgia in 2021. The Marine Corps actually purchased 20 of these and deployed them at different installations around the country. You think about MCLB Albany, they are the first U.S. military installation to achieve net zero. And that was through the deployment of other resources, including large solar PV array, large amount of landfill gas generation, and then an 8 megawatt steam turbine where they get steam from an adjacent Procter and Gamble plant. I believe that plant makes Charmin and Bounty. But this EV charging and resilience is just one of the strategies that this base has used to not only become net zero. They're now saying that they are ready for, whatever comes at them. They're able to support their mission if the grid goes down for as much as 2 weeks, and that includes providing energy and water for their mission critical facilities. And this type of EV charging that's resilient is part of that whole strategy. Next, please. Here's a microgrid example for a county bus depot. This one's in Montgomery County, Maryland, where this countywide bus depot is located in Brockville. They have, I think, 24 different chargers here in varying capacities. Some are made for faster charging, some are made for more maintenance charging of buses. I think there's a fleet of over 100 buses here. Not all of them EV yet, but many of them are. There is 2 megawatts of solar PV at the site. That's the maximum that's allowed by, I guess, state and utility regulations. But they do have a large battery capacity, 4.3 megawatt, 2-hour lithium-ion battery. And also they have 3 600 kilowatt natural gas generators. So with these resources, they're able to operate normally connected to the grid using as much solar energy as they can produce to charge their electric buses. But then if the grid goes down, they can basically be an island and provide as much of their charging as they need, especially if the natural gas infrastructure is intact. And that's typically what we've seen in many conditions, even hurricanes, flooding. The natural gas infrastructure tends to be very robust and resilient in those different cases. This project was put in the years 2022, 2023. It's nearly completed, but they have installed all of the PV array and the batteries. Montgomery County, Maryland has been a leader in this area. That came about as a result of actions they took following a 2012 derecho event, in which many buildings across Montgomery County were left without power for a number of days. So the county decided to invest in microgrids to replace just standalone backup diesel generators with, or to supplement them, I should say, with solar and storage and combining power and other technologies to help them be more resilient. And at the same time, they're meeting they're starting to meet some of their net zero emissions goals. They're great collaborators and happy to share information with people that are looking to do this in their communities too. Next, please. Finally, here's an example I wanted to share, which is overseas in the UK, in Cornwall. Here's where, an example of where you have an enhanced capacity with a solar PV and battery. And this is actually a privately owned system by a company that provides charging as a service. Here, the existing site only had 100 kW of available electric grid capacity, and upgrades to that grid capacity will take a long time and cost a lot of money. So here they put in a 1 megawatt battery that has 2 hours of capacity, and then also a 60 kW PV array. They have 6 fast chargers, and then those are basically designed for travelers who are passing through, getting a charge on their journey. But they also have 6 slower chargers that are intended for guests at the Holiday Inn Hotel who are staying overnight. They are also planning here to expand the solar by putting in a 1 megawatt solar farm nearby, and then they're also going to have they're also going to get the utility to upgrade the grid, so that they can basically provide full capability at their charging stations. Right now, they do have to sort of manage the capacity and share what's available among the vehicles that are charging. But with the upgrades, they'll be able to not only provide basically zero emission electricity for charging, but they'll be able to make it very robust and resilient too. Next. So, back to the subject of resiliency and these high impact, low frequency events, and one way of looking at those is those, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they categorize these as billion-dollar disasters. And North Carolina, as you can see in this chart here, from 1980 to 2020, had a lot of billion-dollar disasters. And that's what we're planning for. That's what we need to put in these resilient systems for, not only for EV charging, but also to support critical facilities with solar and storage and other distributed resource technologies. I'm part of a team right now that's working on a grant from DOE's Solar Energy Technologies Office, which is looking at helping communities across the state to investigate resilient solar and storage. And some of these events you see here, Hurricane Matthew, Michael, Florence, Dorian, we're collecting data on those events to help really quantify and put a value on the outage, or rather the avoidance of these outages at critical facilities. Next, please. And a tool that we can use to evaluate microgrids comes from NREL, called REOPT. And it's basically an online tool that has some incredible capabilities. It can evaluate different combinations of generation based on the load profile for the site, whether it be a building, a campus of multiple buildings, and then you can also put in loads from EV charging. He'll basically come up with 2 different kind of outcomes. One will be a financially optimized outcome, which says based on your loads, here's what PV, battery storage, other technologies might be the most cost effective on a life cycle or net present value basis. And then it looks at resilience mode, where you can specify a duration of outage, let's say 24 hours or 48 hours, and it'll model you can either model the financially optimized system to see how that would perform, or it would also come up with a new resiliency optimized mode. And this is where, with resiliency, we have to incorporate, these impacts, the cost or, value of avoiding these impacts into this model to help us justify, these investments. Next, please. Here's just an example of a REOPT analysis we did for a shelter school in North Carolina. I believe it was in Bertie County. Here we were looking at providing full support for the school for its loads during an outage period. And this outage here is modeled to happen at the peak time of the year, which was in August, which is the time when you could have hurricanes, prospectively. And what you see is outside of the outage duration, the white areas of the chart, and the light gray is where you're getting power from the grid. The red is where you're getting power from the PV array. So this PV array here, we sized it at 590 kW. That turned out to be the financially optimal case. That provides a good portion of the power, or the energy, I should say, for the site. But when you go into the outage condition, which actually happened in the afternoon and went overnight, the PV is not going to produce so much in the red. But you can see that the blue, which is the battery, which is storing the PV energy, that's providing a lot of the load or energy you need, especially during those like kind of higher kind of demand times. And then you see in the yellow, the generator, it's kind of serving as a base load. And this was an existing generator that we modeled here. And one of the key findings of this type of analysis is not only that, well, not only are we looking at, what's an optimal system that brings solar PV and storage into a site, making it more resilient when coupled with an existing generator at a positive net present value, it's reducing the reliance of this site on diesel fuel for backup. In this case, I think we've reduced the need for diesel fuel by 40 to 50% over what it would be required in an outage, in a normal outage without solar PV and storage. And that's important where you might have, limited supply of diesel fuel during a widespread outage. Next, please. So just wrapping up here, I wanted to just share some information on the DOE RACER Resilient Ready Communities project that we have under a grant from DOE. In this grant, we're working to enable local communities, particularly working with emergency management agencies and local community organizations, to work together to make informed decisions for deployment of resilient solar PV and energy storage. Well, they'll have the greatest impact on improving community resilience. And EV charging resilience is going to be an important part of that. One of the first places we want to do that is where, local government fleets, especially first responder fleets, are transitioning to EVs. We want to make those resilient. But then we also want to make sure that the community has access to resilient charging infrastructure so they can, have that as a resource, whether or not they're staying in place or whether they're going to evacuate. Next slide. And there's 4 different task areas here under this grant. We're engaging with stakeholders, coming up with a metrics and framework for community resilience, a playbook for emergency managers. But the most important one to, I think, the people here is that we have a 4th task, which is providing assistance, technical assistance to a cohort of communities. This will be collecting data, using the REOP tool, working with the local agencies and the community to help identify the best places for resilient systems. Next slide. I'll just leave it at, we look forward to hearing from some of you about, getting assistance through this RACER project. And this RACER project is going to complement the work that we're doing for the Upper Coastal Plain Council of Governments by actually doing some of the work, some of the analysis, helping communities find projects that they can seek funding for, and at the same time, complementing the amazing analysis that Alex is doing. With that, I'll turn it back over to Heather.
Hello, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can engage in the future with us. So in addition to reaching out to Isaac regarding the READY project, if you're interested in working with him on that, we will be doing some further actions together with Upper Coastal Plains Council of Governments. We have a webinar coming up on November 13th that is about federal funding that you can go and apply for to go and use towards EVSE resilience projects. We also will have some in-person workshops that will be coming up in the winter. And so please keep an eye out in your email for those. We would love, anyone local, we would love to go and see you there. At those workshops, some of the things that we will be doing, we will be going more in depth into some of these topics that we covered in this, about an hour today. We also will be gathering feedback from local communities on the criteria weighting surveys for the EV charging station and microgrid site suitability analysis that ADRI is participating, as well as getting thoughts and feedback on the way that they are setting up the network model. And also just going deeper into the topic of microgrids and how to implement them and what to think about when prioritizing sites for where you might consider putting in a microgrid. And with that, let's see, we can take some questions. Here's our contact information if you have any questions for any of us. And let's see, so one question that I see has to do about some of the data for EV registrations. I'm pretty sure that Alex was using the data from the NCDOT public website, which does have the count by county every quarter published. And I believe they started publishing that in 2018, and you can go and see it through now. And regarding like more granular data, that's not currently publicly available through their website, though depending on what sort of agency you work for, you probably could go and request it through the North Carolina DMV if you wanted. On the question of, is anyone looking at grid capacity to support these additional EVs and the load that they are putting in? I can take a stab at that, or if Isaac wants to take a stab at it, either way. Maybe I'll start off. So I certainly I know that that Duke Energy has talked in some of their stakeholder meetings about doing this sort of analysis. I have not personally seen the results of that analysis. I do know that they are often concerned about security, and so they're what the data that they choose to go and share with the public is often limited. That said, I do know that they've looked at it. Isaac, did you want to talk a little bit more about this, or I can go and continue?
Yeah, could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, there was some noise in the background. I couldn't hear it quite well.
Yeah, there was a question about like grid capacity and electric vehicles and who's looking at this. And I was saying that I know that Duke Energy has looked at this question. I have not seen the results of that analysis.
Yeah, it's a very, sorry, Heather. That's certainly being covered as a consideration under, long-term, long-range planning in the integrated resource plan, where they're, coming up with load projections. Now, the thing is, though, it has to be done really on a case-by-case basis, where you're looking at, substations as well as distribution circuits, where these things are being deployed, and a lot of it is being done, like that on a very, sort of a case-by-case basis. But
my understanding is that right now, under the current set of rules that they are operating under from the Utilities Commission, they, in many ways, it's difficult for them to go and do anything other than react on a case-by-case basis. But I don't know if we have time in this webinar to get into the details of how the Utility Commission works with our utilities.
Yeah.
But it's a very complicated question. I would say that yes, there are people looking at it to answer the question, but it is an area where we continue to need to do more work.
I think as we have about 1 minute left in our hour, I just wanted to wrap things up for us today. There's a lot of, first of all, thank you. Lots of great information, some of it admittedly way over my head, I know for a lot of our member governments or local governments out there, you know, if you guys could bring away a couple of takeaways here, is that there are more webinars to come, but we are focusing on a couple of different things. Understanding and analyzing people evacuating into the Upper Coastal Plain region and the electric vehicles coming down the road in the future, all these new owners, where does that charging stations need to be to keep them moving? And when they get to your town, and you've experienced this, right? People evacuating to your town, to your emergency shelters, do you have charging for them? The other thing you need to think about in your local community for safety is where that critical infrastructure is that needs various kinds of backup power. Some of you in your hazmat plans, heck, almost all of you in some of your hazmat plans have said, we need generators for this or that. Well, sometimes that's more than a generator. Sometimes there are alternatives. And right now in the federal government, there is a lot of money being put into these alternative energy sources. So if you can wind up with something that's a diesel generator, a natural gas generator, a solar power backup, an EV charging station, bought and paid for, that you could implement in your town to serve your community facility, be it a school, a volunteer fire department, a town hall, or whatever, you need to tune in and know about that. So we're doing analysis. Next workshop is on funding. And we've just got some of the smartest people I have known over the years on this topic matter at the table with us, part of our team right now for these planning efforts. Because we know the flooding's coming. We know the heat waves will come. We know that the power outages will happen. We know that our elderly residents will come over to our community centers and say, I don't have AC and you've got to keep me cool. And you've got to have ways to do those things for your citizens and for people in your area. So that's what we're trying to prepare for. Now's the time, because this is when the money's hitting the table. So stay tuned. Reach out to me anytime. My name is not on the final slide here, but you know, rtownley@ucpcog.org. You can find myself, Ben, Tyrant, Betsy, a whole slew of us know all about this. Not all about what they know, but about the work, and we'll help you out. Thank you.
You're on.
And we'll make